When power goes unchecked for too long, it only takes one mistake to bring it all crashing down. It started like any other shift for Officer Daniel Pierce. Another hot afternoon in Jackson, Mississippi. Another routine patrol down Woodrow Wilson Avenue. The sun hung high, heat waves rippling off the asphalt as he sipped his convenience store coffee, half watching the road, half thinking about his weekend plans. Then he saw it. A black 2014 Cadillac CTS rolling through a yellow light that in Pierce's eyes looked a little too close to red. His fingers moved automatically, flipping on his lights. The siren let out a sharp whoop as the car pulled over to the side, smooth and controlled. No hesitation, no last-second swerve. If anything, the driver seemed unfazed. Pierce adjusted his belt, stepping out with the same authority he carried every day. He had done this 1,000 times before. This was just another stop. But the moment he reached the driver's side window, something about the man behind the wheel rubbed him the wrong way. The driver was an older black man, early 60s, clean-shaven, sharp-eyed, with a posture that didn't slouch, even while seated. He wore a neatly pressed short-sleeve button-up, nothing flashy, but everything about him seemed collected. Pierce didn't like that. "License and registration," he said, keeping his voice firm. The man didn't reach for anything right away. Instead, he glanced up, meeting Pierce's eyes with a steady calm that made the officer grip his belt a little tighter. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" His tone wasn't confrontational, just precise. Pierce exhaled sharply through his nose. He hated when they asked, hated when they didn't just do what they were told. "You ran a red light," he said. The man raised an eyebrow, glancing briefly at the intersection in his rearview mirror before turning back to Pierce. "That light was yellow when I crossed it," he replied evenly. "I'm sure of it." Pierce's jaw tightened. He didn't have a dashcam recording to prove otherwise, but that didn't matter. His word was law out here. "License, registration," he repeated, his patience thinning. This time, the man nodded and calmly reached into his glove compartment, pulling out his registration and ID. He handed them over without another word. Pierce scanned the name on the license. Samuel Reynolds. Didn't ring a bell. But something about the way Reynolds handed over the documents, no fumbling, no unnecessary movement, made Pierce's skin prickle. The man wasn't scared. That bothered him. "Step out of the car," Pierce ordered. Reynolds frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because I said so." A pause. It wasn't long, but it was enough for Pierce to feel the shift. Reynolds held his gaze for a beat longer than most would dare, and then slowly he sighed. Not out of fear. Out of something else. A quiet understanding. "All right," Reynolds said, pushing the door open. He moved with precision, unfolding himself from the car with an ease that suggested this wasn't his first time dealing with authority. Pierce didn't like that either. He gestured to the back of the car. "Hands on the trunk." Reynolds did as he was told, but as Pierce patted him down, he heard the man mutter something under his breath. "This is unnecessary." Pierce clenched his jaw. "Excuse me? You have my ID. You ran my plates. You know I'm clean." Pierce didn't respond. He finished his search and stepped back. Then, without warning, he reached for his cuffs. Reynolds stiffened. "What are you doing?" "Turn around," Pierce said. "For what?" "I said turn around." But this time, Reynolds didn't move. And that was when Pierce made the worst decision of his career. He grabbed Reynolds' arm. The air changed instantly. Because before Pierce could snap the cuffs on, Reynolds turned, fast, controlled. And suddenly, Pierce wasn't holding an older man's wrist. He was holding the wrist of someone who had been trained to break holds like this 1,000 times before. For the first time that day, Officer Daniel Pierce felt the first sting of doubt, but he didn't let go. Something was about to go very, very wrong. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. Pierce's grip on Reynolds' wrist tightened, but the older man didn't resist, didn't pull away, didn't fight. He just stood there, calm, controlled. That pissed Pierce off even more. "I said turn around," he snapped, yanking Reynolds' arm. The older man exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. Then in a voice that carried no fear, he said, "Officer, I strongly suggest you think carefully about what you're doing." Pierce's blood boiled. He wasn't about to be lectured by some old man who thought he knew better. "Think carefully?" he scoffed. "You're refusing to comply. That's resisting." Reynolds' eyes locked onto his, sharp as steel. "I'm not resisting. I'm questioning an unlawful detainment." Pierce didn't care. His pride was already bruised. He needed control of the situation. So, without another word, he forced Reynolds around and slammed him against the trunk of the Cadillac. Hard. Reynolds let out a grunt as Pierce shoved his forearm between his shoulder blades, wrenching his arms behind his back. The metal of the cuffs bit into Reynolds' wrists with a loud click. "You're under arrest," Pierce said. "For what?" Reynolds asked, his voice still maddeningly calm. Pierce hesitated. For what? He should have thought about that before cuffing the man, but now, with his hands on him, his brain scrambled for an excuse. "Obstruction," he blurted out. "Interfering with an officer's investigation." Reynolds let out a slow breath, shaking his head, not in fear, in disappointment. Pierce wasn't used to that reaction. Most people begged, got angry, or broke down, but this man, he just looked tired. Pierce didn't have time to dwell on it. He grabbed the radio clip to his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Officer Pierce. I have a male suspect in custody requesting transport to the station." There was a crackle, then a response. 10-4, what's the charge? Pierce opened his mouth, then hesitated. Before he could answer, Reynolds spoke first. "This is a mistake, officer," he said, turning his head slightly, "and it's one you're going to regret." Pierce let out a bitter laugh. "That's so?" Reynolds didn't smile, didn't curse, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at him. And for the first time, Pierce felt something creep into his chest. Not anger, not frustration, something colder, doubt. But there was no turning back now. Pierce hauled Reynolds toward his cruiser, pushing him into the back seat with a little extra force. He didn't slam the door right away. Instead, he looked at the man through the wire partition. "But you're not so calm now," Pierce muttered under his breath. Reynolds' eyes met his in the mirror, still steady, still unshaken. And then, with absolute certainty, he said, "You don't know who I am, do you?" Pierce scoffed. "Should I?" Reynolds held his gaze for a moment longer, then leaned back against the seat, completely at ease, like a man who already knew exactly how this was going to play out. Pierce didn't like that, didn't like it one bit. But he was about to find out exactly who he just put in cuffs. Pierce sat at his desk, flipping through his phone while waiting for Reynolds to be processed. It was just another day, another arrest, no big deal. But then, his sergeant's voice cut through the station like a blade. "Pierce, get in my office, now." Pierce barely had time to react before he was on his feet, pushing open the glass door. Something was wrong. Sergeant Bill Whitaker, a thick-set man with a face carved from years of stress and cheap coffee, was already standing by his desk, phone in hand, his expression thunderous. "You mind telling me," Whitaker growled, "why the hell I have a U.S. Army colonel sitting in our holding cell?" Pierce blinked. "A what?" Whitaker slammed the phone onto his desk. "Colonel Samuel Reynolds, 30-year veteran of the United States Army, 2 tours overseas, Pentagon security clearance, and a direct line to the damn Secretary of Defense." The blood drained from Pierce's face. I didn't know." "No, you didn't." Whitaker ran a hand down his face. "Because you didn't check his damn ID before deciding to flex your ego on the side of the road." Pierce opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "You realize what you just did?" Whitaker continued, his voice dangerously low. "You put cuffs on a man who's had more clearance, more authority, and more training than you will ever have. And now?" He gestured toward the window overlooking the station floor. Pierce turned, and his stomach dropped. Phones were ringing non-stop. Officers were whispering in tight circles. And at the front desk, a group of men in suits, stiff postures, stone-cold expressions, stood like statues. Federal agents. Pierce felt his pulse hammering against his skull. Whitaker wasn't finished. "We've already had 3 different military officials call, demanding to know why one of their own was thrown into a holding cell like a common criminal." He jabbed a finger toward Pierce's chest. "And don't think for a second that this is just going away." Pierce swallowed hard. "Sarge, he wasn't cooperating. He questioned me. He knew his rights," Whitaker barked. "And you didn't like it. That's what this was about." Pierce's hands curled into fists. "So what, we're just letting him go?" Whitaker let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, we're not just letting him go." He grabbed a folder from his desk and slapped it against Pierce's chest. Pierce caught it, frowning. "What's this?" Whitaker's eyes were cold. An internal review. Pierce's stomach twisted. We're going to look into every single one of your stops from the past year, Whitaker said. And you better pray to whatever God you believe in that this was a one-time incident. But Sarge, get out of my office, Pierce. Pierce's jaw clenched, but he turned and left, fists tight at his sides. He had no idea how bad this was about to get. Reynolds sat calmly in the holding cell, hands folded in his lap, watching as the chaos unfolded outside. He had made exactly one phone call. That was all it took. Now, he could sit back and let the system that Officer Pierce had relied on for so long work against him for once. The door buzzed open. A man in a dark blue suit stepped in, flanked by two other men. Their movements were precise, calculated, military through and through. Reynolds stood. "Colonel," the man in the suit said with a nod, "you're free to go." Reynolds smiled faintly. "That was quick." The man shrugged. "You know how these things go." Reynolds did, all too well. As he stepped out, his eyes flicked toward the squad room. Across the station, Pierce stood near the lockers, his face pale, his hands gripping the folder like a vice. Reynolds didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The damage was already done. And this was only the beginning. Pierce barely made it through the rest of his shift. Every conversation in the station felt like it stopped the second he walked by. Every glance from his fellow officers carried something between amusement and caution, like they were watching a slow-motion train wreck. By the time he got to his locker, his hands were still shaking. Not from fear, from anger. He slammed the locker door shut. This was ridiculous. He was the one being investigated? For what? Doing his job? Reynolds didn't listen. Reynolds didn't comply. What was he supposed to do? Let some old man challenge his authority? He took a breath, trying to steady himself. This would all blow over. He just needed to sit tight, keep his head down, and let it pass. Then he checked his phone. And that's when he knew he was screwed. The body cam footage was everywhere. News stations, social media, even the department's own website had an official statement about the ongoing review. The video of Pierce arresting Reynolds had already racked up hundreds of thousands of views, and the comments were brutal. Another power-hungry cop who thought he could get away with it. This man served his country, and this is the thanks he gets? Fire him. Press charges. Make an example out of him. Pierce scrolled, his breathing getting heavier with every comment. It wasn't just random internet nobodies either. Politicians were speaking out. Military officials were weighing in. The story was gaining traction fast, and it was clear the department wasn't going to sweep this under the rug. And then he saw it. A new email from Internal Affairs. Mandatory review of past incidents. Immediate compliance required. Pierce felt the blood drain from his face. They weren't just looking at Reynolds' arrest. They were digging through his entire career. Over the next few days, things only got worse. A junior investigator named Elena Martinez was assigned to comb through his record. She was young, sharp, and most importantly, she had nothing to lose. Pierce sat across from her in the interview room, arms crossed over his chest. "How long is this going to take?" Martinez didn't even look up from the file. "Depends. You've got, 10 years on the force?" She flipped a page. "That's a lot of stops to go through." Pierce exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "It was a lawful arrest. You people are blowing this out of proportion." Martinez finally looked at him, eyebrow raised. "Is that so?" She slid a document across the table. Pierce glanced down. It was his own traffic stop history. His stomach twisted. Hundreds of stops, and a very clear pattern. Martinez tapped the paper. "Want to explain why over 80% of your stops were black men?" Pierce's jaw tightened. "I don't target people. I stop suspicious vehicles." Martinez didn't blink. "Right. And in the last year, out of all those stops, you've only issued citations to about 15%. Pierce shrugged. "Warnings. Some people deserve a break." Martinez leaned in slightly. "Except the people you let go? Overwhelmingly white." Silence. Martinez studied him for a long moment. "You see the problem here, Officer Pierce?" Pierce clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to play into this game. But Martinez wasn't done. "You ever hear of a pattern of behavior?" she continued. "One bad stop? Maybe it's a mistake. But when we see the same thing happen over and over..." She shrugged. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. Pierce felt his pulse thundering in his ears. "We're putting you on unpaid leave," Martinez said, sliding another paper forward, "pending further review." That was it. The words that made his stomach drop. Unpaid leave. For the first time, real panic set in. Pierce shot out of his chair. "You're suspending me? Over one traffic stop?" Martinez sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's not just one stop, Pierce. It's a pattern." She leaned back, arms crossed. "And let's be honest, you thought that badge made you untouchable." She stood, grabbing her files. "You were wrong." Pierce just stood there, stunned, furious, and, deep down, terrified. Because this wasn't going away, and he knew it. Pierce had always thought of himself as untouchable, a survivor. He'd seen other officers go down for misconduct, but not him. Not Daniel Pierce. He knew how to walk the line, just close enough to the edge without ever tipping over. But now he was falling. He sat in his apartment, staring at the letter from the department. Unpaid suspension, pending termination review. His phone buzzed. Another missed call from his union rep. He ignored it. They wouldn't help him. Not this time. The department had already started distancing themselves, releasing statements about accountability and commitment to community trust. It was all PR, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. Pierce was expendable. He grabbed the remote and flipped on the news. There it was. His name, his face, and that damn body cam footage playing on a loop. And then, Colonel Reynolds, standing at a podium, flanked by military officials, reporters hanging onto every word. Pierce turned up the volume. "This is bigger than just one man's experience," Reynolds was saying. His voice was measured, calm, but firm. "It's about a system that allows unchecked power to go unchallenged." Pierce scoffed. "Oh, give me a break." But Reynolds wasn't done. "I served my country for 30 years. I've seen war. I've seen injustice in foreign lands. And yet, in my own home, I was treated as if I was less than, simply for questioning why I was being detained." Pierce felt his chest tighten. Reynolds looked straight into the cameras. "I don't want an apology. I don't want a settlement. I want real change." The crowd erupted in applause. Pierce shut the TV off. He felt sick. 2 days later, he got a call from his lawyer. "They're offering a deal," the lawyer said. "Resign quietly. No charges, no trial. Just walk away." Pierce gripped the phone. "And if I don't?" A pause. "Then they'll make an example out of you." Pierce didn't respond, because deep down, he knew he had already lost. The next morning, a single line appeared in the Jackson Tribune. "Officer Daniel Pierce has officially resigned from the force following the controversial arrest of Colonel Samuel Reynolds." Just like that, it was over. But the consequences, those were just beginning. Pierce sat on his couch, staring at the blank TV screen. The room felt smaller than it had ever been, quieter. For 10 years, his badge had been his shield, his authority, his power, his protection. Now, he had nothing. No pension, no farewell ceremony, just a name tied to a scandal. He thought about fighting it, thought about going on one of those talk shows where disgraced officers tried to spin their stories. But what good would it do? People had already made up their minds, and for the first time, he wasn't sure they were wrong. Reynolds, on the other hand, was far from done. His case had sparked a movement. The mayor's office announced new oversight policies. The police department implemented mandatory racial bias training. Civil rights groups were calling for broader reform, but that wasn't what mattered most to him. What mattered was that, for once, someone like Officer Pierce didn't just walk away unscathed. He hadn't fought for revenge. He had fought for accountability, because without it, this would happen again. And that's the lesson here. Power without accountability is dangerous. When people think they can get away with anything, they will. But eventually, someone will stand up. Someone will fight back. And when that happens, the badge won't protect them anymore. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone thought they were untouchable, only to get exactly what they deserved? Let's talk in the comments.